The room went quiet in a way that felt intentional, like someone had turned down the volume on my life. Crystal glasses clinked somewhere behind me, the carpet softened my footsteps, and every face I knew suddenly looked past me instead of at me. My chest tightened as I realized I was standing alone in a crowd that had already decided something without me. If you have ever felt the ground shift beneath you because someone you trusted rewrote the rules, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from, because this kind of betrayal is never as rare as it seems. I remember the heat of the lights, the faint scent of wine, and the way my pulse pounded in my ears while I tried to understand how I had become the problem in my own story. Nothing was said out loud, but everything was clear. This wasn't an accident. It was a removal. That was the moment everything I believed about my family and my future began to unravel. I knew something was wrong the moment the room went quiet. 1 second, I was standing under warm lights at a charity gala in Chicago, believing I belonged there, and the next I felt every eye turn toward me like a verdict already decided. I am not young, not loud, not the kind of woman people rush to defend. I have learned to take up little space. That night, someone used that against me. I felt the heat in my face before I understood why. Papers that should have stayed private were suddenly being referenced, framed as concern, dressed up as polite confusion. The shame hit first, sharp and public, followed by the awful awareness that no one was stepping in. I remember the clink of glasses, the polished shoes, the low murmur that kept going as if I were no longer human. I stood there smiling too tightly, my heart racing, my mind trying to keep up, and then it landed. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't gossip that slipped. It was timed, staged, delivered in front of exactly the right people. Someone close to me wanted me exposed, not embarrassed, removed. As I walked out into the cold night air, I understood that whatever this was, it had been planned long before I ever walked into that room. I had never seen myself as important enough to betray. Before that night, my life was quiet, structured, and built around showing up for the people I loved. I was widowed in my late 40s, the kind of loss that teaches you how to survive without expecting applause. I learned to manage grief privately, to raise my son with steadiness, and to keep promises even when no one was watching. My husband and I had built a small construction company in Illinois from the ground up. When he passed, I stayed on as a co-owner, but I stepped back from daily decisions. I trusted my son to lead, and I trusted his wife to support him. It felt natural, almost comforting, to let the next generation take over. Most days followed a simple rhythm: morning coffee, paperwork at the kitchen table, occasional site visits where I stayed in the background. I told myself that respect meant restraint. There were moments that didn't sit right. A tone shift, meetings I wasn't invited to, small choices made without explanation. I noticed them, then dismissed them, because suspicion felt uglier than trust. I believed loyalty was inherited, that family protected its own. I believed love filled in the gaps where clarity was missing. Looking back now, I can see how safe I felt, and how unprepared I was for the moment when that safety quietly disappeared. That version of me believed stability was permanent, that silence meant peace, and that the people closest to me would never see me as expendable or disposable. I went into the office that afternoon for the most ordinary reason. I was looking for an old insurance folder, something dull and familiar, something that still belonged to the version of my life where problems stayed small. The room smelled like dust and paper. Sunlight cut through the blinds, landing on the same filing cabinet my husband once labeled by hand. I felt calm there, grounded by routine, until a drawer stuck and forced me to pull harder than I meant to. Behind the folders I expected was an envelope I did not recognize, thick, unmarked, hidden too carefully to be forgotten. My chest tightened before I even opened it, as if my body understood something my mind had not caught up to yet. Inside were copies of contracts, bank statements, and emails printed late at night, numbers that did not belong to our accounts, projects I had never approved, and then a name I knew too well, appearing again and again in places it should never have been. I sat down on the floor because my legs stopped working. My hands shook so badly I had to press the papers flat against the carpet. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, that I was misreading something, that motherhood meant giving the benefit of the doubt. But the pattern was there. Quiet. Methodical. Intentional. What scared me most was not the money or the risk to the business. It was the realization that this had been going on while I was making dinners, attending birthdays, believing in the safety of my own family. I put everything back exactly where I found it. I turned off the light, and as I closed the door, I knew the house I trusted was no longer just a home anymore. I went back into my days as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The same offices, the same meetings, the same faces. Yet the air felt thinner, like I was walking through a room after an argument no one would name. People smiled faster and stopped sooner. Conversations paused when I entered, then restarted with safer topics. Files that once crossed my desk now stayed closed, passed hand to hand just out of reach. No one was cruel. That was the part that unsettled me most. I began noticing where people stood, who sat beside whom, who avoided eye contact. Invitations came later or not at all. Decisions were already made by the time I heard about them. Each small change was easy to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. I replayed interactions in my head at night, testing them for meaning. The pauses were longer than before. The reassurances felt rehearsed. I realized I was being managed, not consulted. What hurt was recognizing how gently it was done. Isolation wrapped in politeness. Distance disguised as respect. I had become inconvenient, a variable that needed controlling. The anger came quietly, not explosive, not loud. It settled in my chest as clarity. This was not about misunderstanding or concern. This was strategy. By the time I admitted that to myself, I understood the shift completely. The problem was no longer what I had found. The problem was that I was still here, watching. And somewhere between those glances and silences, I began to suspect that simply existing, asking questions, refusing to disappear, had turned me into the threat they needed to address next, inside myself, entirely alone. I realized it during a meeting that should have been routine. Nothing dramatic happened. No accusation, no raised voices, just a careful suggestion that maybe I should rest more. Let others handle things. Trust the process. It wasn't said once. It was repeated, softened, echoed from different mouths. Each time, it landed the same way. I was being framed as tired, emotional, outdated. My questions were described as worry, my objections as confusion, my authority as concern for my well-being. I started tracking it quietly. Who spoke for me before I arrived? Who summarized my thoughts without asking? How decisions were finalized and then explained to me, slowly, as if I might not follow. That was when it clicked. The issue was no longer the documents or the money or the risk. The issue was me, my memory, my ownership, my refusal to step aside without answers. Age became the easiest tool, not used openly, just implied. A tilt of the head, a patient tone. The assumption that I could be guided out rather than confronted. The anger surprised me by how calm it felt, clear, focused, useful. I understood then that staying unaware had been a kindness they no longer needed to offer. From that moment on, I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. I started watching, listening, and preparing, knowing that awareness itself had made me a liability. It meant survival would depend on silence, timing, and patience, and that every step forward would need to look like compliance while remaining deliberate inside from that point on. It would have been easier to turn my son into a villain. Anger would have given me distance. Blame would have simplified everything. But the truth refused to cooperate. When I looked back honestly, I saw the changes long before the documents. The way his shoulders stayed tense, how sleep never seemed to restore him, how conversations became shorter, heavier, filled with pauses he did not explain. He had lost his father young, even though he was already a man. That kind of grief doesn't announce itself. It settles into responsibility, into the belief that failure is not an option. Add financial pressure, expectations, and someone whispering solutions that feel urgent, and fear begins to make decisions. I noticed how he stopped meeting my eyes when money came up, how his laughter faded, how he flinched at conflict, choosing avoidance instead of honesty. At the time, I thought it was stress. I didn't yet understand it was containment. The hardest realization was accepting that he was not leading this. He was reacting, cornered by promises he didn't fully control, consequences he didn't know how to escape, and a power dynamic he was unequipped to challenge. As his mother, disappointment came first. As a woman who had survived loss, compassion followed close behind. I recognized the signs of someone shrinking themselves to survive. That truth broke me in a different way, because it meant protecting myself could also mean destroying him, and saving him would require me to walk into danger with my eyes open. That night, I understood I could not choose between being a mother and being a witness. Whatever came next would demand both, and the weight of that realization followed me into the dark, where sleep no longer felt possible. That night, sleep never came. The house was still, the kind of quiet that usually feels safe, but every sound felt amplified. The clock marked time I wasn't using. Midnight passed, then 1:30 a.m., then 3. I lay there replaying everything. The documents, the meeting, the looks that lasted a second too long, the softness in voices that hadn't been there before. I lined them up in my head, not emotionally this time, but carefully, like pieces that had been waiting for the right order. Patterns started to form, decisions that followed conversations I was excluded from, financial pressure that appeared right before certain suggestions were made, how my son's fear made him predictable, and how predictability made him useful to someone else. At first, the weight of it all pressed down on my chest. I felt old, tired, outmatched. I thought about how easy it would be to do nothing, to let time smooth things over the way it always had before. But clarity has a way of cutting through exhaustion. Somewhere between 4 a.m. and the first hint of morning, fear stopped running the show. My thoughts slowed, sharpened. I understood then that reacting had been my mistake. Emotion made me visible. Questions made me dangerous. What I needed was distance, control, and time. By dawn, I wasn't calmer, but I was decided. Whatever this had become, it wasn't going to resolve itself. Silence would be a tool. Patience would be protection. And from that moment on, every move I made would be intentional, even if it looked like surrender to anyone watching. I stopped pushing back after that night, not because I believed them, but because I understood how dangerous resistance looked coming from me. I softened everything: my voice, my questions, my presence. I let meetings move on without me. I asked for explanations twice instead of once, then nodded as if they finally made sense. I allowed myself to appear tired, uncertain, relieved when decisions were made without my input. It felt unnatural, like shrinking inside my own skin, but I forced myself to hold the shape, and it worked. I noticed the change almost immediately. The tension eased, watchful eyes relaxed, updates came with less caution. The silence around me grew looser, careless. Inside, nothing softened. My thoughts stayed sharp. I listened more than I spoke. I memorized timelines. I tracked what was said, and what suddenly wasn't. There was a strange mix of fear and satisfaction in realizing how easily I could be dismissed. How quickly competence was forgotten once I performed confusion. It showed me how little they had needed to believe in my weakness. Every day I reminded myself that this was temporary, that surrender was a costume, that appearing smaller gave me room to see everything by letting her think she had won. I could feel the ground shifting, not in my favor yet, but enough to sense an opening forming, and once I saw it, I knew the next mistake would not be mine. That understanding steadied me, even as I kept my head lowered and my intentions carefully hidden from everyone around me. It happened during what should have been an ordinary moment. Nothing tense, nothing dramatic, just a casual interaction that came after weeks of me playing smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. That was when she slipped. Not in anger, not in confession, but in confidence. There was a passing comment, framed like reassurance, that carried too much certainty, an assumption that outcomes were already decided, that processes were handled, that people stayed in line once they understood what was good for them. My stomach dropped, even as my face stayed neutral. I felt the room tilt, the way it does when a truth lands before you're ready for it. She wasn't improvising. She wasn't reacting to circumstances. She was recounting something she believed was finished, managed, contained. In that moment, I understood how long she had been planning, how deeply she believed she was protected, the ease with which she referenced consequences, not as threats, but as facts of life. What terrified me wasn't the arrogance. It was the calm, the sense that she was watching me, measuring whether I truly understood my place. I realized then that my performance had worked too well. She no longer saw me as a risk. She saw me as someone being evaluated, someone who could be tolerated as long as I stayed predictable. That clarity burned through any doubt I had left. This was never about misunderstanding or family conflict. It was about control, leverage, and removing obstacles quietly. As I left that interaction, my hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow. I knew then that silence had limits, that staying still too long would become consent. Whatever came next, I could no longer pretend I was simply surviving. I was being tested, and failing to respond would not keep me safe. I thought about leaving. Of course I did. The idea surfaced every time fear tightened my chest, every time silence felt like a warning instead of peace. Running would have been simple in theory. Sell what I could. Create distance. Let time blur the edges of what had happened. But distance would not have protected my son. It would have left him alone inside a situation he was already struggling to survive. I kept hearing my husband's voice in my head, not words, but values. The way he believed that ownership meant responsibility, that walking away from truth only feeds it power. We built our life on showing up, even when it cost us comfort. Fear argued hard. It showed me all the ways this could end badly, but responsibility spoke quieter. and deeper. I was still a mother, still a co-owner, still someone whose absence would solve other people's problems far too easily. Staying was not bravery, it was alignment. Leaving would have meant abandoning my son to consequences he didn't fully understand and betraying the principles that had carried me through widowhood. Once I saw it that way, the decision settled, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. I would stay, I would be careful, and I would do what was necessary to protect my child and the truth. I reached a point where grit stopped being enough. Awareness without action was just another way to lose slowly, and I could feel the ground shifting beyond what I could manage alone. Asking for help terrified me. Trust had been fractured, and every outside door felt like it could swing back on me. I worried about exposure, about consequences arriving before protection did. Still, isolation was doing more damage than discretion ever could. I thought carefully about who could be trusted. Not friends, not family, people bound by duty, confidentiality, and process. I moved quietly, choosing restraint over urgency, accuracy over relief. The first step was small and deliberate. I shared only what was necessary, nothing more. My hands shook afterward, not from doubt, but from the release of carrying it alone for so long. Fear didn't disappear. It changed shape. There was anxiety in knowing I had set something in motion I could not fully control. But there was also a subtle lift, a sense that weight had shifted off my chest and onto systems built to hold it. From that moment, time stopped being mine to manage. The story was no longer contained within walls I recognized. Whatever came next would move outward, faster and louder than I preferred, and I understood that staying steady would matter more than staying hidden when stakes rose and choices narrowed suddenly. I knew the moment silence ended. It was not loud at first, just a shift, like air pressure changing before a storm. What I had carried privately was no longer contained, and I could feel it moving beyond me. There were signs before confirmation, subtle pauses, messages that stopped mid-sentence. The sense that doors I could not see were opening. I understood then that control was gone, and nothing I said or withheld could pull it back. Fear came fast, not of exposure itself, but of consequences I could not predict. My name, my history, my family were no longer mine alone. Privacy dissolved into something thin and fragile, and yet, beneath that fear was relief, a heavy, reluctant relief. I was no longer pleading to be believed inside closed rooms. The truth was standing on its own now, imperfect but visible. When the story finally broke, there was a strange stillness afterward. The waiting I had lived in for months collapsed into a single moment of quiet. I sat with the weight of it, feeling both emptied and anchored. Nothing could be undone. Relationships would change. Reputations would fracture. But the truth was no longer bending around silence. It was out, irreversible, and whatever came next would be shaped by honesty instead of fear. I breathed slowly, accepting that exposure had replaced uncertainty, and that surviving this chapter would demand patience, restraint, and faith that truth, once released, carries its own momentum long after control is surrendered. Even when fear returns, I will meet it without retreat again. After the truth became public, the consequences arrived quietly, then all at once. There was no dramatic collapse, just a steady erosion of what I once called normal. Phone calls stopped, invitations faded, familiar faces learned how to look past me. Some losses were immediate and permanent. Relationships I had carried for decades fractured under the weight of discomfort and fear. My reputation, once unremarkable and steady, became something debated in rooms I was no longer invited into. Normal days disappeared. The hardest cost lived inside my family. My son carried his own shame and confusion, and I carried the guilt of knowing my protection had still wounded him. Our conversations grew careful, slower. Shaped by trust, we were rebuilding rather than assuming. Love remained, but innocence did not. There were moments I questioned myself, late afternoons when the house felt too quiet, mornings when starting over felt heavier than staying silent ever would have. Truth does not reward you quickly, and it does not shield you from grief. But I never regretted the choice. I accepted the cost the moment I spoke, even if I did not yet understand its full weight. Protecting my son, honoring my values, and refusing to live inside a lie mattered more than comfort. Some things were lost forever. Others changed shape. I learned that doing the right thing does not leave you untouched, but it does leave you standing, able to look at yourself. It has been some time since everything fell apart, long enough for the noise to quiet, but not long enough for the memory to fade. Life looks different now, smaller, more deliberate. My days follow steadier routines. Fewer people move in and out of my world, and that is by design. I protect my space. I protect my energy. Safety has become a priority instead of an afterthought. My son is here, still healing, still learning how to trust himself again. We talk more carefully than we once did, but we talk honestly. There are pauses, setbacks, and moments when the past resurfaces without warning. We face those moments together instead of pretending they do not exist. Not everything was repaired. Some relationships remain broken, and some doors will never reopen. I have stopped knocking on them. Closure, I learned, is not always something you are given. What remains is strength I did not know I had. Clear boundaries, a quieter kind of confidence. I no longer confuse peace with silence or loyalty with self-sacrifice. I am grateful for the calm we have now, even with its scars. The truth cost us dearly, but it gave us something priceless in return. We are safe, we are honest, and we are still here, ready to carry forward this experience together.